Good evening, Miami alumni and friends, and happy Charter Day. I'm Mark Masechko, Associate Executive Director of the Miami University Alumni Association, and I think we are in for a really exciting Charter Day celebration, talking about one of my favorite topics, bourbon. So tonight's webinar, Rye Revolution, a virtual tasting, is part of our Winter College 2026 webinar series. This is the sixth year that we've hosted Winter College in this virtual format. And there are still more Winter College webinars coming up this week, so please feel free to sign up and join us for the rest of the series. We have an amazing crowd tonight watching from all over the country, including alumni from classes from 1965 through 2024, which represents nearly 60 years of Miamians. So it's a good Charter Day crowd, that's for sure.
Yay.
So those of you watching live, feel free to submit your questions and comments through the webinar using the questions link on the screen. We recognize one thing right now, that we aren't the only important live Miami event happening tonight. We are keeping a close eye on the undefeated men's basketball team and their game against UMass, and we will share updates throughout the evening. So you can watch this webinar and enjoy the bourbon and still have an eye on that basketball game. So with that, I'd like to introduce our host for the evening, Phil Kollin, who graduated from Miami in 2000 and is host of Unique and Custom Whiskey Adventures. He's an executive bourbon steward, a certified tourism ambassador, and is also the founder of Phil Talks Whiskey. Pretty safe to say, Phil knows his bourbon. Now, Mike Crowder is also joining us. He's the associate provost and dean of the graduate school and a professor here at Miami. He's also an executive bourbon steward, and Mike's Crowder Laboratory analyzes distilled spirits to develop a library of chemical fingerprints for authentication purposes and to map the chemical content of bourbons with consumer preferences. So I believe we are in good bourbon hands this evening, and I am really excited about that. So Phil and Mike, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Let's talk some bourbon. Phil, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you always for the stellar introduction. Good evening, Mike.
Good evening, Phil. How are you?
I'm delighted to be back here once again. This is becoming old hat, and it is just as exciting every time. It's always a bit strange because I'm used to talking to live crowds. So I see you, I see me, I see Mark, but I know that we've got dozens and dozens of people streaming along. So we are going to have some fun tonight. This is the first time I can say that I am a proud graduate of Miami University, the home of the single and only undefeated men's basketball team in the country. And that's been a fun ride. Holy cannoli. Good gravy. 25-0. And soon, as we trounce those pesky Minutemen of UMass tonight, 26-0. So like Mark said, we'll have updates on the screen because, man, I feel like every game has been watching, it's been like a tournament game with a lot of close ends and close finishes. So, we'll win. I'll drive up to Mac and Joe's for late night wings. I'm only 2 hours and 45 minutes away. So by the time we get out of here, I can make it to Oxford. My name is Philip Kollin. I am based in Louisville, Kentucky. I run the bourbon adventure company called Phil Talks Whiskey, where I create and host unique custom bourbon adventures, all centered around the beautiful world of whiskey. It's called Phil Talks Whiskey because I love talking about whiskey, the lore, the history, the process behind it, the business side, some tall tales, and even drinking it from time to time. There's always a lot to say about whiskey, and tonight we're digging into the world of rye whiskey. What's rye whiskey? How is it different than Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey? What can you expect to taste? What bottles are good? And we're going to get into all of that of the next hour. I've been looking forward to this all weekend, including yesterday, because, I'm a big whiskey advocate. But fun fact about me, I only drink whiskey on days that begin with T. So I'm glad today's Tuesday, and then we have tomorrow, Thursday, to Friday, Saturday. If you want to connect with me, you can find me on Instagram at Derby City Phil. I'm also on Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it today, at Derby City Phil. And I host tastings and private events all over. So invite me to your clubhouse, your pool house, your boardroom, your birthday party, and we'll have a good time. Discounted rates if you can bring Swoop with you. A huge discount if you can get the Miami mascot. Or for all you older alumni, Harry the Hawk. You can get Harry to come. It's virtually free. I also invite you guys to share your image tonight. I'm only looking at me here, so I love to see what people's setup have. So feel free to drop an email or an image to the chain so we can see how your setup is tonight. I know we've got 3 bottles tonight. We're calling it a Rye Revolution. And there's only one rule tonight, and that's we only ask that you sip when we sip. We're all in this together. So we'll go one by one and kind of explore the different flavors and pours in each bottle of rye. Whenever we do these, since you're providing your own whiskey, we try to make it so the bottles are widely available and inexpensive. So hopefully everyone here had no trouble finding the bottles and finding them at a reasonable price. I always say, with all the bourbon boom and whiskey boom out there, it's amazing how many bottles are in that sweet spot of that $20 to $40 range. There are some tremendous whiskeys available. So tonight, we're going to be tasting in order. So get your bottles ready. There's always an order, and there's a method behind our madness. We're going to taste the Rittenhouse Rye Bottled-in-Bond product, Sazerac Rye, and we're going to end with that Bulleit 95 Rye. All these are worth your time. And that's what makes them great. And if you don't care for it, it's your choice. I am Bourbon Switzerland. I'm friend to all, loyal to none. So I want you to like what you like, but I'm definitely excited to share with you. Also, we said, if you have questions, drop them into the chat. Mike and I love getting questions. We want to talk about what you want to hear about. So we'll try to address those, and they'll pop up as we go. And I promise, if there's one thing I've learned, it's not to keep you too long from drinking. So we'll get into it. I thought I might share some news about what's going on in the bourbon world and let Mike say hello and anything he wants to add to what is already too long of an introduction that's stopping us from drinking. Mike, what do you got to say?
No, it was great, Phil. I'm Mike Crowder. I'm in my 31st year at Miami. I just got my clock for 30 years of service.
Hey, congratulations.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And so several years ago, my group and I started doing research on distilled spirits, and mostly the work we do is on bourbons. We do have a liquor license. We can distill our own liquor in the lab, but unfortunately it has to be destroyed in the lab after we make it and analyze it. I'm very excited about choosing rye. It's a perfect whiskey for the wintertime. As you guys are going to tell, it has unbelievable spice. Ryes are great as they're neat. You can add ice to them, or even better, if you're making bourbon cocktails, use rye whiskey instead, and that spice will cut through the sugar of the mixers, and it will give you a completely different taste to your cocktail. So we have some science we're going to discuss tonight. I promise not too much chemistry, but just enough that hopefully you'll be interested in it. And I promise no organic chemistry or very little of it in my sections of it. So enjoy tonight. Yeah, I know, Phil.
I still have nightmares about organic chem, and I was a comm major. That's how bad the stuff was. Awesome. The one thing we were excited to showcase rye whiskey and mix things up is rye whiskey is making a resurgence now. For a long time, it was only what the old man at the bar drank. Bourbon was on the back burner. Rye was on death's door, but it really has a history that predates America before 1776. And now most major distillers make a rye whiskey, but even today, not all of them. Maker's Mark doesn't offer a rye whiskey product. Four Roses doesn't offer a product. Four Roses, you may have heard, has been in the news lately. For years, ever since Seagram's broke apart around 1999-2000, they've been owned by the Kirin Japanese Brewing Company, because when Kirin bought them, they were the #1 selling Kentucky bourbon in Japan, and they really wanted that vertical to have both the beer and the whiskey. Kirin announced last fall that they want to diversify their international holdings and move into all things more healthcare products, so they're selling their American whiskey brand. And it was just announced last week that E&J Gallo Winery, the massive California-based winery and spirits giant, largest family-owned winery in America, is going to be purchasing Four Roses to the pretty penny of $775 million, along with incentives. And that'll be interesting to see what happens. What will they change? What they won't? And sometimes these deals even don't go through. But when you have those deals that are $500 million and up, it certainly makes some waves in bourbon country. So Four Roses, one of the few major Kentucky distilleries that doesn't dabble in rye whiskey. And who knows? Maybe we'll see that change. Maybe the offerings will change. But things happen fast, so we got to hold our breath until the sale goes through in second quarter to see if anything changes. Always like to shatter some myths. 3 great bottles. One of them is the screw cap. Never, ever judge a whiskey by its cork topper or its bottle topper. Sometimes with the screw cap, it's just as good. But let's talk a little about history. What makes rye whiskey rye whiskey? How is it different than bourbon? This is one question I get all the time. So if we want to pop up the slides and talk about how do you know if you're drinking a rye or how do you drink a bourbon, in so many ways they're similar. They're made predominantly in America. They have the same kind of requirements about being aged for a number of times in that oak barrel. It comes down to one main thing that separates rye whiskey from bourbon whiskey. Now, remember, if you've attended any of other sessions, they're both kinds of whiskey. It's like saying all Hondas are cars, but not all cars are Hondas. You have Tennessee whiskey, Irish whiskey, Scotch whiskey. So what makes it rye whiskey? The biggest difference is in the mash bill. By law, bourbon has to be 51% corn, essentially a corn whiskey, usually closer to 60 to 80% corn in the mash bill. And for rye, it has to be 51% corn, so you reverse it. This is where it gets interesting because rye bottles vary wildly from that soft Woodford Reserve rye that's about 52% rye grain to that Bulleit rye that has that really famous 95% rye grain recipe. So some of the most popular rye brands that you probably heard over the years are Old Overholt, Rittenhouse, Templeton out of Iowa, and Whistle Pig out of Vermont. Old Overholt and Rittenhouse have been around for years. And one of the things that's led to rye's giant resurgence is how versatile they are in cocktails. Usually you put bourbon in things like an old fashioned, a mint julep, a whiskey sour, stuff like that. Rye, primarily used in Manhattans, Sazeracs, sidecars, all these different fun rye cocktail where the spicy notes really mix with some of the other ingredients and juices you can put on there. Just about every brand, like I said, is making a rye. I once talked to Eddie Russell at Wild Turkey. By the way, it was on the honorable mention list, but the Russell's Reserve 6-year rye from Wild Turkey is absolutely tremendous. And he said that years ago when they were producing and rye wasn't as big, they maybe made rye 10 to 15 days a year. They turned off the giant stills for bourbon, converted them to rye for about half a month. Now they do it 2 to 3 days a month. So they're producing much more rye than they had before. Another thing we won't talk too much about is that when it comes to aging, bourbon needs every point of that, depending on who you ask, 3, 4, 5, or even 6 years to be ready for prime time, to ease off the green whiskey, to get rid of that heat that doesn't hit your palate so well. Rye, for the different reasons to distill and the different grains that go into it, ages faster. A fully mature rye is available at anywhere from 2 to 4 years. So what other ways can we talk about how bourbon and rye are different from one another? It's basically what notes you get out of sipping them. I can smell a glass and know if it's going to be a high rye or a high wheat or corn-based bourbon. With rye, you get those fruit, spice, a lot of the bitter flavors, very peppery. Bourbon, light, sweet, especially bourbons that use rye. Rye is robust. Wheat is sweet, is what Bourbon Hall of Famer Freddie Johnson says down there at Buffalo Trace. Rye is a smoother consistency. Rye has the strong consistency where bourbon is smoother. You don't feel too much on the tip of your tongue, the side of your tongue. And then again, rye makes great as a cocktail base. Traditionally not sipped neat as much, although that's how I like it. And bourbon is great also as a cocktail base, but you find much more on the rocks, water back, neat stuff like that. Finer ryes, when you get into the ryes that are aged 12, 15, 18 years, woo-hoo-hoo! Break out the pocketbook and break into the savings. Those can be very, very expensive. Where bourbon, because there's more available, the extra age bourbons you can still find at under $100 in a lot of cases. Rye has a very unique history that is distinctly American, and I promise we'll get to sipping after this. Prior to the American Revolution, the number one beverage that was consumed in the colonies was rum. People loved their rum, but everything changed over a 40-year period because after the war, whiskey quickly grew to displace rum as America's favorite distilled beverage. Liquor tastes have always been cyclical in America. Think about the 60s when it was gin and vodka. Then we went to California wine and light beers before bourbon once again had its day in the sun. But rum, which required molasses from the British West Indies, was more expensive and less easily acquired than locally grown wheat, rye, and corn that was in the area. Well, what did them in was the catalyst of the 1764 Sugar Act. The British imposed heavy taxes on anything that was molasses that was imported from the non-British colonies, which made rum production much more expensive and politically fraught. So that's why you see the revolutionaries in the corner. So whiskey, 100% American at that time. You could do it there and it was easier to distill. So very quickly, rye started usurping rum as the drink of the colonies. Fast forward to the revolution right after, and like any spirit that has its heyday, the growth of rye whiskey was a direct product of people and geography. When I'm talking about geography, I'm talking about Pennsylvania, Maryland, a little bit Virginia, a little bit New York. Rocky soil, rough, really poor for wheat, really bad for corn. Corn would have its heyday when we get out to Kentucky and different parts of Indiana, Tennessee, and Ohio where it grows like there's no tomorrow. But at the time, rye grew so well, and it was the undisputed king of the spirits in Pennsylvania and Maryland. And when we talk about the people, two main groups, Germans and Scotch-Irish, brought their distilling traditions that really benefited rye. We have the people from Germany who knew a lot about distilling both schnapps and rye, and they used that process to make some of the early rye. And the Scotch-Irish have a long tradition of distilling grain spirits rather than making beer or fermenting wine. So those three things combined, the outgoing of rum, the Cadillacs with the Sugar Act, and then the people of Pennsylvania and Maryland who are German and Scotch-Irish made it the rise of whiskey. And then you have your first American brand, your first time we can identify the original America's native spirit. I love bourbon. I will talk bourbon until I'm blue in the face and defend it till the day is long. But it does not have the advocates that rye whiskey does, because Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey was not the first American spirit. It was Monongahela style rye whiskey, and I did not fall over pronouncing Monongahela, and I was confident I would. The first distinct American whiskey named after the western Pennsylvania area of the Monongahela River Valley. This was about the 1780s, just after the Revolution. The mash bill, it was a high rye, but also had malted barley, little to no corn, different than kind of the high rye we think about today. Very different production. You can see that baby pot still there, similar to what they're using. Small but really heavy copper steels that were cleaned and reused every time, made limited quantities. These weren't the commercial productions we think of, but they were still going a lot, and they were very good at their craft. What they had, the result, was a flavorful spirit, heavy, oily, robust, very different from what we have today. Also important to know that aging wasn't a thing with whiskey as far back as the 1750s. And it didn't really become a consistent thing until about the 1850s. So people were drinking the white dog, not aged, clear as day, heavy bite, given that white dog because it howls like my 5-year-old terrier mix that we just got in my house. 1790s, as a result of the Monongahela style rye whiskey, we started having aged rye, started beginning. It wasn't the charred oak yet, but it was aged in barrels that started giving it some color and flavor. All right. Mike, what do you think? Time to drink?
I think it is.
Our first pour this evening, I promise I wouldn't keep you waiting too long. It's the Rittenhouse Rye. This coming out of the Heaven Hill Distillery. We're going to have a pour, and then we'll put up some information. We'll talk all about this one. By the way, when you get through tonight, 3 big products to taste. I'm always eager to know what your favorite is. So you'll have to tell me in the comments or email which of the 3 you enjoyed. All very different. All fully matured, nothing too young. This is the one with the screw top. Never judge a bottle by its screw top. That beloved Buffalo Trace product, W.O. Weller 12-year, screw top. That overpriced bottle that's got miniature Derringer pistols on it, not very good. Don't judge a bottle by its screw top. Drink your bourbon any way you please. That's what Fred Noah, Jim Beam says. I'm having mine in a rocks glass with a couple cubes of ice and a heavy hand because it's Mardi Gras on top of everything else. And we don't need many excuses to drink in Kentucky, but I'm always, Mardi Gras sounds like as good as using any. This is 100 proof. It's aged 6 years. It's made by the Heaven Hill Distillery. We'll drink, and then we'll talk more about it. Cheers to Miami University men's basketball. Swoop, that's our bird. 6-point lead and an incredibly historic season. Cheers. Swoop, that's our bird. Swoop, that's all right. Mike, could you bring up Mark? Could you bring up the slide so I can show the fine people all about what we're drinking? Oh, there it is. Rittenhouse Rye. Heaven Hill, you probably know it. You know it well. One of the largest distilleries in America. A number of their brands are showcased below. Evan Williams, the number 2 or 3 selling bourbon in the world, and a lot of wells. We also have Larceny, Heaven Hill, Elijah Craig, Henry McKenna, 10-year Bottled-in-Bond, one of my favorite, often slept-on bottles. But they do a fair amount of ryes here as well. They have giant stills. In fact, their downtown distillery is the largest single still in the state, maybe in the country. Fills something like 1,200 barrels a day, 52-gallon barrels a day, so it's very big. The brand was founded by the Shapiro brothers in 1935. And what's funny about these guys is they didn't know anything about whiskey. So what they started doing over the course of 20 and 30 years was buying up other brands and names. So this Rittenhouse Rye has a long history, but wasn't created specifically by Heaven Hill, but certainly popularized by them. We can't drink a Heaven Hill product that has that big 100 on it and is labeled as Bottled-in-Bond without harping on what Bottled-in-Bond means. In short, it means that everything in this bottle is guaranteed by an 1897 act of law to be at least 4 years old, to be bottled at exactly 100 proof, and to be done under the care of one distiller at one distillery during one distilling season. This was done as a mark of quality in 1897. We fast forward into an area where industrial production was on the rise, and there was a lot of rot gut bad whiskey that was being topped off in barrels to give it the color and consistency by adding everything from tobacco spit to prune juice to, in some cases, even rattlesnake heads. So the person who invented the Bottled-in-Bond Act, Colonel Taylor, also a well-known name in bourbon, wanted to have a way that his product stood out as by doing it the hard way. So little trivia for you, people get this wrong. Bottled-in-Bond can apply to any American spirit, not just bourbon. That's why this straight rye whiskey carries the Bottled-in-Bond label. Fun note that Mike added I wanted to touch on. Always more to say about bourbon. Always fun stuff to say. Colonel Taylor loved many things, Colonel E.H. Taylor, but he also loved saving money. So when he lobbied the government to put in the Bottled-in-Bond Act of 1897, and he wanted to be a full law that everyone had to follow, and they instead said it's a criteria that is the mark of quality that makes your whiskey stand out, he did it in part to make his brand stand out, but it's also a way that he could help compete with some of the strong Canadian and even import whiskeys there, and also cut down on the amount of taxes he'd have by having it created as a separate character. If there's one thing Taylor was known for in his day, it was always finding a clever way to save a buck or two. We could do a whole presentation about that. The last thing I want to say about this before we move on and have another sip, I'm going to have another sip right now. You guys talk amongst yourself. The Ottoman Empire was neither Ottoman nor an empire. Is that the mash bill is very important. This is 51% rye. What does that mean? It is the bare minimum of rye content that you can have to still call it a rye. This is 37% corn. Along with that Woodford Reserve I mentioned, some of the others, this is the most corn-forward low rye you'll have. I don't like using the word smooth too much because that betrays some of the other flavors, but this is probably the one that's going to be the easiest, softest sipper of the ones we'll taste tonight. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't, but with only 51% rye, this is what you might consider a softer rye as far as it hits you. Last but not least, we have pictures of their devastating fire in 1996. 7 warehouses, 96,000 barrels, all went up in flames on one November night. They lost 17% of their whiskey, and some estimates say as much as 2% of the world's whiskey supply fell in one night. Bourbon warehouses were redesigned after that. Now they have to be at least 400 feet apart and have some type of water suppression and protection. But Heaven Hill is in amazing shape now, one of the biggest distilleries and most beloved. And a look there at the bottom is their Heaven Hill distillery. I really like this pour. Mark, what do you think?
I think it's excellent, and I would love for people to put in the chat, what do they smell and does it come through on the taste? Because to me, there is a great forward nose on this that reminds me of when I grew up in Southern Virginia. And so I'd love to see if other people are smelling and tasting that as well.
Great base for a cocktail, especially the price is right on this. Rittenhouse is good. Sometimes it gets overlooked because, when you go to a liquor store, it's about thigh high. It's not down on your ankles. It's not your shoulders. But anything that it has that Bottled-in-Bond certification, it's going to be 4 years and 100 proof. No one's putting their bad stuff in a Bottled-in-Bond bottle, especially Heaven Hill, who loves that. So many of their expressions have been given the Bottled-in-Bond label. I think this is a good one.
Excellent.
All right, so we're tasting, we're sipping. Now we're going to listen. I'm going to switch gears and turn over to Mike, and he's going to dig into some chemistry.
Yeah, so thanks, Phil. And this is a very, very good pour. I totally agree with you. And ryes are just so distinctive, and there's so much fun to actually taste. So could you show my first slide? I hope everybody's had plenty to drink because we are going to talk about a little bit of chemistry. One thing that's pretty surprising, given the fact that rye has been around longer than bourbon, is that it's been completely understudied. And a lot of it has to do with what Phil talked about, was that rye went out of favor and it was almost dead. And so there really wasn't much science being done to sort of evaluate why this particular rye whiskey tastes the way it does. And I spent several weeks looking on the internet. And what I did was I found a group of articles. There was probably 40 or 50 web pages, and I put this table together. And so to kind of show you what's on this table, I have in the first left column the congener class. These are the chemicals that actually we find in whiskeys. And so you'll see words like terpenes, and then there's esters and aldehydes and furfural and all of these great things, vanillin down at the bottom. And then what I did is I compared what is on these websites. These websites say that rye whiskeys have high terpene levels. They have high 4-VG. I'm going to define what that is. It's a compound that's called 4-vinyl guaiacol. But aldehydes are higher than they are in bourbons, and furfural is higher. Vanillin is lower than in bourbon. So bourbons have more of that vanilla taste. And so, and then I included what the bourbon level was on these websites, and then sort of the flavors that you see with this. The one I do want to point out to you is that top one, that 4-vinyl guaiacol. This has a clove, a pepper, spice taste to it. And I think we're doing some studies now. I think this is the key chemical that gives that spice flavor to rye whiskeys. So next slide, Mark.
The 3 most common notes you would pick up on a typical rye whiskey, clove, pepper, and spice, are going to be top of that list.
Always. You'll hear people say that all the time. But you'll also hear something that Phil said too. You will do fruits. You'll hear herbal, citrus will also be very common with rye whiskeys as well. And with this one, the herbal is, well, I'm not going to tell you what I smell because it's more important what you smell and what you taste. So next slide, Mark, please. So we went over this in some of the other presentations we've done. One of the techniques we use in Hughes Laboratories is NMR spectroscopy. Over on the right is a picture of the actual NMR that we collect our data on. And over the years, we've collected NMR spectra of 1,100 bourbons, but only 10 rye whiskeys. And what we do over on the left side shows you a picture of what we put in the instrument. It's just little glass tubes. We put bourbon in it. We put it into that big thing over on the right, and we get something that looks like this a bunch of lines. And we can interpret these lines to see what chemicals are actually in bourbon or in rye whiskey. So next slide, Mark, please. And so here's data that we've actually collected on those 10 rye whiskeys and on the 1,100 or so bourbons. And so I know there's a lot of data here, but what I did want to point out a couple of things to you is aldehyde was one of the things that was mentioned higher in ryes than it is in bourbons. But by our data, we see that those two numbers are almost identical. They have about 2.7 millimolar acetaldehyde in all of them that we've ever tested. Furfural was said to be higher in rye whiskeys than in bourbons. And as you can see, they're almost identical numbers. And these are thousands of compound or samples that we've analyzed. The vanillin, which we can actually taste more in the bourbon, you can see it's almost an identical number in the rye whiskeys that we've analyzed and in the bourbons that we've done. And so if you'll go to the next slide, Mark. So we can kind of correct what we've seen. We've got some spacing issues, but these compounds, the aldehydes, the furfurols, the vanillins, and the fusel oils, they are not higher or lower in rye. They're almost identical to the bourbons that we've analyzed. And so what that means is that the compounds that are easy to detect with NMR, we can't tell a difference chemically between rye and bourbons, yet they taste very different. Now, what I'm going to talk about after we've had our next taste, because it is getting close to being time for our next taste, is that there's 3 or 4 compounds that I've listed here. The 4-vinyl guaiacol, the terpenes, certain esters, and lactones that are at such low values we can't detect with an NMR. So we have to go to a different instrument to try to analyze the rye whiskeys for these compounds, and we will talk about that in just a minute.
Ooh.
So back to you, Phil. Yeah, I know.
Well,
this is serious stuff right here, Phil.
I'm telling you, a little quiz for you. What holiday did we celebrate yesterday, Mike?
It was Saturday was Valentine's Day. I don't know what was yesterday.
President's Day.
Oh, okay.
Which takes us right to our next. We're going to talk a little about George Washington. There he is, George Washington, distiller in chief. You can say this completely real 1797 era photo that was taken by a photographer. George Washington with a scowl, and for some reason distilling with his Revolutionary War hat on. But I like that he's using the whiskey thief. This was very fitting. It's hard to talk about the early days of American whiskey without mentioning George Washington, especially because a lot of people aren't aware that the first ever U.S. ex-president was also a distiller. So his birthday is next week, February 22nd, and he probably celebrated his birthday in 1797 by returning to his farm in Mount Vernon, and he was eager to get some extra income. Not a lot of money to be had in the early days of America. Certainly, he didn't take a job as a university president or a political leader after his presidency, and he had a chance that distilling might bring in some profit. That was something he was really interested in. He was encouraged by the guy who managed his farm, who was a Scottish guy named James Anderson, who had a lot of experience distilling grain in both Scotland and Virginia. And in 1797, he convinced Washington that Mount Vernon crops and the existing grist mill would have been perfect for distilling whiskey. It was an amazing success at the time. You would have thought this would have been a small endeavor on the far side of Mount Vernon, but he built something that was very big, but was also unfortunately very short-lived. Keep in mind that he wasn't the only one doing this. Small East Coast distilleries were incredibly common at the turn of the 19th century. If we fast forward a bit to 1810, it said there was more than 3,600 distillers operating in the state of Virginia alone. But this means that he had even more claim to be one of the biggest. The average Virginia distillery had maybe 1 to 2 small stills, distilled maybe 650 gallons a year. His had a distillery that was much bigger. 5 different copper pot stills, could produce 11,000 gallons a year. And in 1798, it was the largest active distiller in the country. His distillery was 2,200 square feet, which doesn't sound big, but the average distillery was a quarter of that at about 800 feet. 5 copper pot stills went for 12 months. The average one used only 1 or 2, and the value of what he distilled would be about $120,000 worth of distillate he put up. Unfortunately, all 5 copper pot stills are lost to history. But man, wouldn't that be a great episode of Pawn Stars where someone walks in and says, I can't believe what I have in my garage. So I'm holding out hope that somewhere in a storage unit, somewhere, it's one of these 5 original copper pot stills that George Washington made whiskey from. What did he distill? Rye whiskey. Not the same type of rye whiskey we have today. The mash bill very different than the 95 rye. What he made wouldn't have tasted like the rye whiskey you would like today. 60% rye, 35% corn, 5% malted barley. The rye was distilled twice and sold as common whiskey. Smaller amounts, very small amounts, were distilled up to 4 times, making them much more expensive and much better. But yes, sadly, some of their whiskey was rectified and filtered to remove impurities, but also flavored with cinnamon or persimmon or other things. Why was that? Well, let's ask the question that everyone wants to know. Next slide, please. Was George Washington's whiskey any good? No, not so much. He was making whiskey, but it was not aged. It wasn't bottled. Aside from those little things I talked about, that was double, distilled and made to taste a little better. It was sold as uncharred common whiskey, sold immediately down the road to Alexandria for some quick cash. He also was big on taxes. It's kind of funny that a guy who helped be part of a whiskey revolution years earlier and was in the middle between Hamilton and Jefferson and a liquor tax, he paid the specific tax that caused the Whiskey Rebellion. He himself became one of the people who paid it. He paid $332 in federal excise tax in 1798. Unfortunately, his death in 1799 all but ended the brief success of the distillery. His nephew, a guy named Lawrence Lewis, inherited the distillery and continued on for a few years, but unfortunately, the distillery burned down just about all of it in 1814. However, in 2007, it reopened. The first thing they did was recreate his original recipe. And now in the gift shop in some places around the country, you can buy the current modern day Mount Vernon whiskey. And it's been online now for about 18 years. One of my favorite parts of the story about George Washington being truly one of the first American whiskey makers in a size and scope that wasn't normally found in the area was that many years later, ironically, when temperance movements and the prohibition was starting to get really big in the 1840s and then continued all the way into success in 1919, there was the Washingtonian Temperance Society, also known as the Washingtonians, and they were founded in Baltimore by 6 former drinkers who were aiming for complete and total abstinence of nationwide of all things alcohol, and they named themselves in honor of George Washington because they thought he was a virtuous man, bigger than alcohol, would never dabble in such things. And the whole fact that he ran and operated a distillery was largely buried and lost to history for the better part of those 80 years between 1840 and 1920. I think it's very funny that the same iconic man can be presented in two different ways, depending on what story they want to tell. So yeah, George Washington, he distilled. He liked whiskey like the rest of us. It's how he spent the twilight years in Mount Vernon, just like that photo shows. If you want to go back to that slide, one of the things I like most about that incredibly realistic photo, it's 1797 because there's a calendar on the wall, and it says 1797. So that's how you know. Pay no attention to any other factual errors. All right, who's ready for our second pour of the night? Oh, I was going to ask for a score update. That's awesome. It's like magic. 37-34, 3-point lead over UMass. 2 minutes 14 to go in the half. Whew, we're going to need a drink.
Yeah, we prefer a 30-point lead at this point, but we'll take a 3.
Our next pour is one of the most famous names in rye whiskey. This is Sazerac whiskey, made by the Buffalo Trace Corporation, that's owned by the Sazerac Company, owned by the Goldring family out of New Orleans, Louisiana. And on the back, they're not messing around. They even tell you that this is used to make the Sazerac cocktail, America's first cocktail. Depending on how much of that legend and lore you want to know, that one has the recipe on it. Mine doesn't have the recipe on it.
Yeah, it's got the recipe.
There you go. They know how their bread's buttered. This is kind of an iconic bottle design that you could find in liquor cabinets throughout much of the 20th century. Not a lot of frills, but a lot of punch. We're going down, though, as far as proof goes. We're only at about 90 proof here. But this one is a classic brand made by the same distillery that makes Buffalo Trace, Eagle Rare, Colonel Taylor, Pappy Van Winkle, Blanton's, and more. And I have a good Pappy story I'm going to tell you in just a minute to pair with this pour. Can we pull up the slide so we can talk a little more about this guy? Classic cocktail. I'm going to say when bourbon was on the back burner, all the brands were suffering except for Jim Beam, Wild Turkey, and Maker's Mark. When rye was suffering, this was probably one of the rye brands that was still found in just about every bar and doing well. Like I said, it's made down at Buffalo Trace. There's the ever scowling face of Harlan Wheatley, master distiller, who, man, does he make great whiskey, but he doesn't always love interacting with the people. Friendly guy, don't get me wrong, but some distillers are made for the spotlight. He'd rather be in the lab or on the still. This is one of those crazy side effects of Buffalo Trace. So this has always been a $30 to $50 bottle. But for several years in recent history, it was impossible to find on the shelf. And you have some stores in Kentucky where they're allowed to charge you as much as they want, and it was going for $80, $100, $150. This is a $30 to $40 bottle, aged about 4 to 6 years, although it doesn't carry an age statement, fully mature, 90 proof, and meant to be a good base and a good mixer. Let's have a sip, and then we'll talk about it. What I love about this one is I think this is the most epitome of a standard rye whiskey. It's got that first smooth flavor, but then a lot of bite on the backside. You feel that peppery heat right here, and you certainly feel it on the side of your tongue and your tip of your tongue. But that first point, the first taste is kind of smooth like you'd have of a nice seasoned bourbon whiskey, and then you feel that pepperiness, that real bite of the rye in there. We don't have the mash bill up on this one, but this is, I know for a fact, it's a much bigger rye boost on this one. I think it's probably 75 to 80% rye, and the rest malted barley with just a little bit corn. So we're going up a lot more on the rye. Buffalo Trace, iconic distillery. People always ask, what place can I not miss if I'm visiting Kentucky and touring the bourbon distilleries? A lot of answers. Because we're short on time, I'll tell you my 2 favorite major heritage distilleries are Maker's Mark, which is absolutely beautiful. They could be making rubber cement down there, and it'd be worth a visit. And Buffalo Trace, where history meets innovation, where the tours are always free, and the allocated bottle drops, if you're into such things, have become ridiculous in the last year and a half, and they always seem to have more than enough of the whiskey to go around. Buffalo Trace is, some people call it Whiskey Wonderland, Whiskey Disney World, and it kind of lives up to that in some ways. And they always have this on the shelf down there. Mike, I want to get your thoughts, and I saw we had a couple questions come in, so I'm going to look at those.
So I totally agree. This is a typical what you think a rye whiskey should be. With this one, with aftertaste, I am going to share it because it is a very distinctive taste. I get a tobacco on the end, which I think is very, very pleasant. And one thing that I would like to mention, Phil mentioned that I was lucky enough to be at Buffalo Trace on Friday. And on the shelf right now, they have a full proof Sazerac Rye at 125 proof. And so this is not allocated. You can just go in and buy it, I guess, until they're out of it. I haven't opened it yet, so I can't tell you anything about it, but I look forward to doing that.
Yeah. Part of the reason we're seeing more expressions is Buffalo Trace is undergoing like a multi-billion-dollar capital improvement plan where they vowed to increase capacity and production to incredible points. Their warehouse is rolling up at a record pace, one every like just a couple months. They installed a second still that's doubled their production, and we're seeing it now. And with wider availability as the products age, we're seeing more stuff like variations, full proof, longer age, not just on their rye, but on a lot of things. A couple questions that were genius that came over. Michael J. Murphy, fellow classmate of mine at my university, said, huge difference in taste with an ice cube compared to neat. Definitely drink it any way you want. I think with these two, if you add ice to it and it melts just a little bit, it's good. Some people definitely prefer their rye ice cold as opposed to room temperature. So try your whiskey all different sorts of way. And then, in a thoughtful question, because Murph's been to a couple of my tastings, why do we start with the highest proof and go to the lowest? Yes, tonight we're going 100 proof, 90 proof, 90 proof. When you're doing a bourbon tasting at home or on your own, I always recommend you go to low proof to high proof. But the truth is, I don't like you people very much, so we're making. No, I'm just kidding. Because it's only 5% alcohol, 10 proof points, and it really kind of tells a story to put together. And the story is really on that percentage of rye grain that's used in the mash bill, not in the proof. I think it's more interesting to taste in this case from low rye percentage to high rye percentage, especially since there's so much closer proof. But if you're doing a tasting, end with that Booker's, end with that Stag's, that stuff is such a flavorful heat bomb that it might overpower lighter stuff you have later. And if you're doing a bourbon that's finished like Angel's Envy or God forbid a flavored spirit like Red Stag by Jim Beam, always finish on that because those might overpower the more subtle notes earlier. And then Rob asked one more question, and then we'll turn it back over to Mike to dig into the chemistry cliffhanger he left us on while I sip. He said, with the tariffs, has the demand for bourbon been reduced much? Will prices change? Complicated question with a complicated answer. It really depends on the distillery itself. Larger international brands who saw their growth in markets like Canada and Western Europe, like Brown-Forman, Beam Suntory, others like that are taking proactive measures. They're not calling it a correction. They're calling it a headwind as they're seeing kind of declining sales with some of the tariffs making it tougher to increase or even maintain sales in some of the countries where it was growing before. But other brands, small craft brands, sometimes they're not even in 17 states, much less internationally. So some of the challenges that are being hit by the tariffs, international politics, aren't hitting all the brands equally. But those brands that you best know as being able to see on the shelves in London and Paris and Greece and Italy, Wild Turkey, Jim Beam, Jack Daniels, Four Roses, yes, those are being impacted. Will prices change? Still too early to say. I think there's supposed to be a big report put out by the Distillers Guild or Distilled Spirits Council in March, and that'll give us more information. 3, excellent question. I'd expect nothing best from Ohio's Public Ivy and home of the 25-0 undefeated men's basketball team. That knowledge on the court translates to street smarts about your whiskey. You know it.
That's right, and the ability to make three-pointers. But one thing with the tariffs that I've noticed that it's easier to find the hard-to-get bottles. Now at our liquor store, they will have Blanton's a whole lot more frequently. Some of the harder ones like the Heaven Hill grain to glass, that was there. The Booker's in the beautiful wooden boxes there. So it's easier for customers to be able to find these hard-to-get pretty amazing bourbons. And so it's a great time for bourbon lovers right now with these tariffs. I would like to see not so many distilleries closing up, but
yes,
that's happening a lot right now as well.
I would say too, though, the distilleries that seem to be closing right now, a lot of them seem to be like from a business mismanagement or some people who kind of got in with a big plan and were counting on a bourbon boom to carry them through. There's exceptions, but a lot of the distilleries who have shut down are ones who may not have been financially sound from the get-go, but we'll see. And also, I don't want to rain on your parade, Mike, but the availability you're seeing at the bourbon in states like Ohio is great. I think some of our state-run liquor stores, like our friends in Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, where the ABC stores are still seeing the not-so-great selection, but hopefully all that's changing nationwide. All right, chemistry. I'm sorry, I'm stepping on your toes.
Yeah, so next slide, please. So I told you in the last slide that I went through that NMR is just not sensitive enough to detect the concentrations, the amount of those chemicals that are at very low levels, but are really important for us to be able to taste ryes. And so what we're doing, and in fact, my student is running samples tonight. we're using an instrument called gas chromatography mass spectrometry. And there's a picture of our instrument. This is a pretty interesting one because she doesn't have to sit at the instrument for hours and hours on a time like with an NMR. She can load up 25 samples in that little thing that I put auto sampler and go home. And during the night, the auto sampler will pick up some sample, put it over in the instrument, run it, then come back and pick up the next sample and do that. And then tomorrow morning when she comes in, she gets a feed out or a readout that looks like this. And each one of those lines is a different chemical, and they're at different amounts. So the bigger the peak largely means the more that chemical is in that sample, and smaller means smaller amounts. So next slide, Mark. So we are currently analyzing those ryes right now, but we're looking for very specific compounds. And one of those compounds is that 4-vinyl guaiacol that I told you about. Now, it turns out that 4-vinyl guaiacol is really not found in rye. What is found in rye is a chemical called ferulic acid. And there's a chemical structure. I'm sorry if this is bringing back nightmares for the organic chemist in the group or the ones that did not enjoy organic chemistry. But ferulic acid is found in a ton of different products, things like popcorn, rye bread, bamboo, oat flakes, and a whole bunch of other things. And it has a very important role in these plants. It's an antioxidant. These plants grow in the presence of sunlight, and sunlight has a lot of damaging rays in it too. Chemicals like ferulic acid protects the plant from that sunlight damage. Well, yeast, when it runs into ferulic acid, converts it into 4-vinyl guaiacol. And it turns out that rye has a lot more of the ferulic acid than corn does, or wheat does, or even the barley that we use in most of the bourbons that we taste. And so next slide, please. So we're analyzing for the 4-vinyl guaiacol. We are hypothesizing there's going to be a lot higher levels in the rye whiskeys. I will tell you already, I looked at the spectrum before I came home. The peak for the 4-vinyl guaiacol is huge in the rye whiskeys compared to the bourbons. We're also looking for 3 other compounds that are listed here, one of which is called limonene, and you might guess what that tastes like. It tastes like lemons or citrus. And that is a flavor that's often associated with rye. And in fact, Phil talked a little bit about that, the citrus smell. There's a chemical called linalool, and I have 2 different structures there. It turns out that linalool can exist in 2 formations. If it's in one formation, we taste coriander. And if it's in a different, our taste buds can tell the difference, and it tastes like lavender. And so it's an amazing compound. We will see high levels of that in rye whiskeys as well. And then the carafilene. This is a picture of that, and this is a peppery taste. So along with the 4-vinyl guaiacol, I believe that this compound is going to also contribute to the peppery taste. Now, one of the things that Phil asked very early on is, why do we love rye? Well, these same compounds, they're called terpenes, are found in high levels in cannabis. So if anybody's craving a slice of pizza right now, it could be because of the rye whiskey that you're sampling with us right now. So
linalool can trick your senses into either reminding you of coriander or rose lavender.
Yes.
Those
well, they're both there.
They're dramatically different senses.
They're both there, but they're in different amounts. And so depending on how the rye is made and which variety of rye, there'll be more of one than the other.
Wow. I can't say I've gotten a lot of rose lavender notes out of rye, but certainly the rest of this I have. And it's funny, the citrus is something I often get on the nose, but not in the taste.
Mm-hmm.
And Linalool, beautiful town in Sweden. I went there for the summer solstice once. Highly recommend that we all go to Linalool over the winter break.
Excellent.
Not a town. All right. Time for another pour. The jokes are getting back. Yeah, I was about to ask for an update. Oh, 5 points at halftime. It's like you can read my mind. I think it's because the bourbon pours are accompanied well by the record-breaking Maction basketball team storming up Millette. Millette's been there like 50. My father-in-law said he went to one of the first events in Millette in like 1968 or 1969. It's absurd. Sellout games, packed crowds, undefeated teams. That's worth drinking our next pour to. We're going on to the final pour tonight, the best-selling rye whiskey on American shelves, and some would argue responsible for the resurgence of rye. This is the Bulleit 95 Rye. And I would guess that many of you have had this before, but we're going to have it one more time. And then we're going to talk a whole lot about what this brand did in a short time and its lore and history. Oh, that's a good sound. I just got a little cue for this one. It's called the 95 Rye because the recipe it uses, 95% rye grain, 5% malted barley, has become so iconic and so well used that they've started adding it to the name of the product on the label. They make this also in a 10-year, and for a while they had it on a 12-year. Which wasn't around long, but it may come back. And both of those are exceptional. But since I wanted to keep cost and availability at the forefront of our tasting, we're doing the everyday Bulleit 95 Rye. You'll notice they make liberal use of that green label. A lot of brands, from Evan Williams to Jim Beam to Woodford, will keep the label the same, but use green to indicate it's a rye whiskey as opposed to a bourbon whiskey. Cheers. Love and honor, my friends. Bite, right? People who don't care for this often say, I feel like I just nibbled into a pine tree, but I love it. I think that's a wonderful collection of flavors that you just don't get in anything else. And almost all that comes from the rye grain. To me, the flavor equivalent is going into a field of rye, scooping off the top, and just taking a big nose of it. Bold, robust, allspice, cloves, peppery. There's nothing that's more over the top of rye than a 95.5 rye. And there's a whole lot to say about this Bulleit Rye, so I want to try to get it in before I run out of town. But this is a classic in a short time for what they've done. Marketing-wise, they were very smart, very savvy. They got in with the bartenders in San Francisco and other craft cocktail cities and said, you know what? This is going to be great for you guys to use in all the drinks you want to make. And so it became a bartender's best friend pretty fast. And that's really contributed to its success. I want to hear what you guys think, and I want to tell some of the secrets behind this one here.
Well, I'll tell you, the smell on this one was lemon pepper for me. That's what I got. And I actually, I thought this was the softest of the three as far as drinking goes. I don't know. It tasted really
different
good.
palates, different tasted. Yeah.
Yeah, it really tasted good. I enjoyed, and I'm not much of a rye guy, so this has been good for me to change a little bit, but I really like that. It's got a really nice flavor.
Now, keep in mind, we get different flavors in whiskey. We get different how we feel about the taste based on proof and age. And all three of these have a relatively same proof. And more or less, this one doesn't carry an age statement either, but I would also guess 4 to 6 years. Yeah. A relatively same age. So the difference we're having this is largely the recipe, the mash bill, the combination of rye.
It's very good.
And can you imagine this in an old fashioned, how wonderful that would be? Yeah. It is just an outstanding product. And this is what Phil said was the bartenders knew they had a deal, and they would make very distinctive cocktails using this 95% rye.
Now, the story of Bulleit comes in two parts. And first, I'm going to highlight and it's from the copy of the distiller, not on the slide makers who provided us tonight, but one of the biggest hunk of is probably not true. No, go back to the slide. We gotta highlight and feature this. At the bottom line, it says Tom Bulleit in 1987 found the secret bourbon recipe. If you believe that Tom Bulleit and his grandfather's desk pulled out a note card with the secret bourbon recipe, I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. Augustus Bulleit, real person, very true early 1800s, was a tavern owner that made bourbon and definitely did it. Simple recipe, probably largely personal, maybe as a side hustle professional. His great, God knows how many great-grandson, Tom Bulleit, came around in 1987. So far, so true. Tom was a lawyer by trade. He'll be the first one to correct you when you say he's a master distiller. But he had the idea of kind of sourcing whiskey and making Bulleit. And his grandfather's recipe, he'll tell you, was simply 2 parts rye, like 1 part, or 2 parts corn, 1 part malted barley for the Bulleit bourbon. It's very simple. Where the story changes dramatically is Tom Bulleit was the right guy at the right time. And when bourbon was starting to boom, Diageo, the international spirits conglomerate who owns everything from Guinness to Smirnoff to Tanqueray and more, realized they didn't have a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. And they sure did like the name Bulleit because it allowed them to have this iconic image without actually associating with any gun or violent imagery. So they paid Tom Bulleit and left him a share of the company, and they got to work rebranding it. And they invented something called Frontier Whiskey. You can see it right there in the bottle. My friends, Frontier Whiskey is not a style of whiskey. I can't tell you what makes Frontier Whiskey. But the first thing they did was bottle design. They were one of the first of the new generation to use that embossed glass where the letters kind of stick out from your side. And they put a label on at an angle. which was designed by a clever marketing team because it makes it look like it's a little askew. It actually creates more real estate to put more text on the bottle. Instead of buying billboards, they bought inner city ads that are on those smaller 8 sheets around bars and restaurants. They got in with the bartenders. They launched a marketing campaign. And the best thing they did, the very best thing Bulleit did, is they knew that rye whiskey was difficult to make, temperamental, and could be tricky. So they leaned on partners in Indiana at a place formerly known as MGP, Midwest Grain Producers, now known as Ross and Squibb. And they're very open. If you take the tour, if you go to them, they will say, in an industry where everything's clandestine and shrouded in secrets, they will say, we can't make rye anywhere near as well as they do. Every drop of our rye comes from Indiana. And on the back of the bottle, it says distilled in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. And my bottle says bottled in Plainview, Illinois. And they've always been very open about giving a tip of the hat to the credit of the people in Indiana who make their rye. Because of that, MGP's 95.5 rye has been celebrated and sourced by a number of other brands who want to use it. So Bulleit Rye, very clever, very audacious with their marketing, and it become the #1 selling rye in a quick time. And a lot of the other ryes out there, not the ones we had tonight, the ones we had tonight have historic basis, different recipes. A lot of the other ryes are copycats, and in a monkey see, monkey do industry are trying to get on the success that Bulleit 95 rye has had. It's a tremendous success story, but it has almost nothing to do with Tom Bulleit finding a secret bourbon recipe as the basis of the brand. I have one more story I want to tell you guys. I know we're short on time, and then we'll get to a few wrap up. But this is a great story I want to say. And then we've got some questions in here too that are great. There's a great question here for you, Mike, about adding drops of water. The one thing I always want people to think of when it comes to whiskey is that it shouldn't be pretentious. When it started making the rounds as either rye whiskey or bourbon whiskey in the 1700s and the 1800s, it was the working man's drink. It was the come home and have a dram of whiskey. It was the drinking at the bar with your friends. The rise of kind of pretentious whiskey is newfound in the last 25 years, and no one has seen it more than Pappy Van Winkle. We always hear about Pappy Van Winkle. It entered the zeitgeist. It's hard to find. You got your Pappy 23 year that goes for absurd prices on the secondary. The family that today still owns Pappy Van Winkle bourbon, which is made with the Buffalo Trace distillery. The Van Winkle family is 51%. Buffalo Trace, which produces, ages, bottles it, and helps sell it, has 49%. The Van Winkle family are as humble as you can get while still owning a major bourbon brand. They live here local in Louisville. Today, it's run by Julian Van Winkle and his son, Preston Van Winkle. And Preston is the great-grandson of Pappy Van Winkle. Not so many years ago, Preston was out with his marketing manager, Scott Smith, and they were doing a tour in New York City, and they stopped in a bar they'd heard good things about. And at the bar, they saw on the top shelf was a Pappy 25, which was a rare expression that doesn't come out every year, and it's highly celebrated, and there's just not a lot of it around. So Preston Van Winkle says, hey, bartender, can I get a pour of that Pappy 25? Let's have some fun. Let's treat ourselves. And the bartender said, no, that's not for sale. And Preston said, what do you mean it's not for sale? We'll want to buy it. He goes, no, we don't touch that one. He goes, I will pay you. I'd like to have it. And he goes, no. And so they talked and goes, let's let cooler heads prevail. So they ended up having some of the Pappy 20 year, which is delicious. And so they went to settle the tab, and Scott Smith, the national sales manager, said, I got this. And Preston goes, no, wait, let me do it. So he hands over his credit card, and the bartender's looking at the card where he just poured him to Pappy Van Winkle pours, and it says Preston Van Winkle. And the bartender says, oh, my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. I'm so sorry. I can't believe this happened. I didn't know that you were in my bar. I wouldn't have known. And Preston said, it's okay. He goes, I'm Preston Van Winkle. And he goes, nice to meet you. And you? And the guy goes, my name's John Blantons. And I always thought it was a great story and a great moment. Just to see the bartender go, oh, I can't believe I did it twice. I can't believe it's happened again. So that's my story. Guys, we'll do some wrap up. Thank you so much for being part of this. It's been absolutely wonderful. I like to end every tasting with a bourbon chocolate. These are from one of my absolute favorite spaces in Louisville. It's called Art Eatables. They make bourbon truffles with different flavors. This one's from Blade and Bow. And yes, unless you have a pairing treat at home, you'll have to watch me enjoy this while I let Mark and Mike say anything. Feel free to connect with me. I'd love to host an event for you. I'm online at Phil Talks Whiskey. And this has been another phenomenal evening. And I hope that you found a new rye whiskey that you lovely and truly enjoy. Yeah, Mike, Mark, I'll let you guys say a few words.
That's good. Well, yeah, I'll hit a couple of these questions if you don't mind. Mike, this one's good for you because it has to do with water. Mm-hmm. A couple of drops of water in these changes the flavor dramatically. more fruit or fruit skins, baking spices, etc.? What's the science there? That's a question from Peter.
Well, so I have two different glasses right now of the Rittenhouse that we poured first. One that I did not put any ice in, and see how clear it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then the one that I put 2 pieces of ice in, notice how it's cloudy.
Huh.
And so what happens is that when you add the ice to it and it melts, the ethanol water concentrations change. And the chemicals that are in these liquids, in these rye whiskeys right now, are balanced to where if it's at 50% ethanol, 50% water, the chemicals in there are perfectly soluble in that liquid. But when you increase the water amount, some of those chemicals are no longer as soluble in the mixture. And so 2 things will happen to those chemicals. One is they start to fall out of solution and go cloudy like this. And another one that you hear people say that it opens up the whiskey is that it degasses. It goes into the gas phase. And when you stick your mouth in the glass and start to smell, you start to smell those chemicals coming out of the liquid better. And so, yes, it really does open up a bourbon or a rye whiskey, and it certainly changes it. You can see it right before your eyes. This is a process called lushing that's very, very common when you drink absinthe. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's very often done with absinthe, but it happens with every whiskey and bourbon I've ever seen. It does the same thing. If you're patient enough to wait, most of the time this is empty before we see any cloudiness at all.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. So Matt and Mark seem to be having a good time. They say here, it's funny you should mention pizza. Ours just came out of the oven. That's funny.
Oh,
but then they asked, of all things, we're getting a similarity to Irish whiskey. Are we wrong?
First of all, you're never wrong. Don't let anyone tell you that that you're wrong when you taste the whiskey and compare it to other flavors. Certainly, Irish whiskey is its own process. A lot of the pot stills, a grain, malted barley and different grains they use more similar to rye. So I would say that traditionally rye whiskeys may remind you more of Irish whiskeys. I think all 3 taste very different personally. But if those are notes you're getting, then you're certainly not wrong. It's not like it says that you're reminding you of, sherry or something that'd be way off. Fireball. No. So I think you're on the right path.
Sure. Okay. This one here is these tasting options are obviously from larger distilleries in Kentucky. Are there any recommended Ohio-based ryes that you would suggest?
Are you allowed to make whiskey in the fine state of Ohio?
I believe
We are.
so.
I kid. So I think the best rye whiskey coming out, a lot of great distilleries show in Ohio. A lot of them are focusing on kind of the basic bourbon, but Middle West Spirits, who keep your eye on them out of Columbus, they have a cask pumpernickel rye that's unique as the day is long and worth tracking down and finding. So Middle West Spirits, their offerings of rye, especially their cask pumpernickel rye. I think other Ohio distilleries, a lot of them kind of new to the scene. So their rye whiskey that they're advertising that maybe is 8, 10, or 12 years are largely going to be sourced expressions, maybe from MGP or from another source that will probably go hand in hand with other things you can have. But Middle West is very cool. And that's one.
I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I was going to say the exact same one. So we had considered other ryes tonight, but one of the things we always do in our tastings is make sure that people can find them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the Ohio distilleries are not as big as the Kentucky ones. And so their products are not as easily found in other states. And so there's some wonderful ryes in the state of Ohio. It's just that you have to go and find them usually in an Ohio store.
Yeah, keep in mind after the end of Prohibition, where it turned liquor controls over to the state, every state has their own liquor control agency. So if you're not Jim Beam, if you're a small Ohio distillery, you have to leverage the relationship in 49 other states in order to get your product on the shelves. And that takes time and money. So some of these smaller Ohio distilleries are just getting things cranking and hard to find, even down here in Kentucky.
Gotcha. Well, I have one question. This is a personal question.
I love a Mark question. You kidding?
Yeah, I got a question. So Phil, your slide was showing like the difference, like the cocktails, rye for this or bourbon for that. Does it really matter? Does it make a difference? Is it okay to use a rye in an old fashioned?
You go into a bar and those are fighting words. So a lot of it comes down to both personal and professional preference. Sometimes in the cocktail books they'll be more adamant about if you're supposed to use a rye whiskey. bourbon whiskey or others. But then you find people who mix it up and have their own take on things. I like cocktails. I largely trust the bartenders making it when I do a drink at home. Usually I don't like to think too much about it, and I get a neat pour. But the base you use for your cocktail, down to the brand and the type of whiskey, is incredibly important for the type of cocktail they're making. For example, Old Grandad 114 is a bourbon that gets overlooked by a lot of people, but bartenders love it because with that high proof and traditional mash bill, they think it makes great. So most bartenders would, with a very affirmative nod, tell you that not only does rye or bourbon whiskey matter, but even the brand and proof matter a great deal.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that's all we have for questions. So,
guys, from the bottom of my heart, there's nothing else I enjoy doing more than talking whiskey. Thank you so much for spending an hour with Mike and myself tonight.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, good to have the team back, Phil.
World tour. Fuel the jet.
Yeah.
Fuel's up in 30.
Well, and on behalf of us at the Alumni Association, we really appreciate both of you spending an evening with us and leading this webinar and sharing so much of your bourbon knowledge. It's my personal favorite. I look forward to doing it every year. So hopefully we'll do it again next year. Thank you both again so much. And as a reminder to all of you who are watching, we still have a number of Winter College 2026 webinars happening this week, including tomorrow at noon with Will Haygood. He was here on campus today as well. And he's doing a webinar about the Black struggle in Vietnam and at home. And that's at noon tomorrow. And then we have people that are really enjoying, tastings. Well, Jack Keegan has a tasting on Friday night, not of bourbon, but of wine. So that might be a great opportunity for you to join a webinar as well. You can sign up and enjoy all these webinars. Looks like we've got the website down there on the screen here, alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Go there. You can find all of our webinars. You can see past webinars too. If you want to rewatch this webinar, you can do all that stuff there.
So Mark, please make sure you tell Jack that they need to stop quitting. If they take the extra step, they can make some amazing brandies.
Yeah, winemakers are just bourbon makers who gave up too early.
That's gotcha. Right. Well, there you go. That's good stuff to pass on. But yes, thank you both again so much. Thank you all out there, all you Miamians. Now that we're done, you can go put your full attention, ESPN Plus. That's where Miami's playing UMass right now. I think they're still at halftime, so probably just coming out for the second half. So make sure you flip over there and cheer on the Red Hawks as they take on UMass and continue this undefeated season. It's going to be a great time. It's been a lot of fun. So thank you again, Mike and Phil. We really appreciate you. Thank you all for joining us this evening. As always, happy Charter Day. It's a great day. 217 years for Miami. Here's to, here's Unreal. To 217 more, right?
217 more. Love and honor.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Love and honor, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.